So I'll just jump in and say welcome everyone to this very exciting first keynote of Liviana 2024. So thank you all for coming. For some of us, it's quite early. For some of us, it's quite late. So I really appreciate everyone being here. Yeah, so Aviv has kindly offered to chair today's keynote. So I think I'll just pass it to him. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear from Kathrin and Kuba.
Cool. Thank you everyone for coming. I guess this is our fifth Liviana. And I think we're managing to create a light but nourishing event, yearly event that we're all, at least I'm always looking forward to. I can't really just sit here without mentioning the frankly terrifying or depressing turn of world events of this past year. I'm not going to list world events that are products of longer processes, but just maybe acknowledges the kind of fear at the pit of my stomach that maybe some other people share. And I think I'm doing that also to highlight that Liviana is more than a professional event, and it's more than a intellectual event. I think for me, the only antidote I can think of for fear at this moment is getting together with people who are engaging with thoughtful scholarship and creative experimental action practice to do what Gibson Graham called proliferating possibilities. So I don't think it's hard for me to think of many people who embody this more than our two keynote speakers today, Kathrin Bohm and Kuba Szreder. I think with the work they're doing with the Center for Plausible Economies and the other work that they're going to tell us about, I think it's yeah, I think they do this work, and they embody something about this network. I think about the Community Economies Research Network, which is a space that allows for things from different categories, such as poetic, pragmatic, to spill freely into each other and to see what kind of possibilities will emerge. And I think that's really necessary right now. I'll just introduce both of them quickly and give the stage to them. Kuba is a curator, cultural organizer, activist, researcher, and senior lecturer at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. Kathrin is an artist, cultural organizer, co-founder of a number of initiatives that hopefully she'll tell you more about, and worked across UK and Germany. They're going to talk about contemporary art, but I think there's something about it that's I think relevant to, like I said before, proliferating possibilities, kind of at the center of community economies thinking. And it'd be good if while you're listening to them speak, you try and kind of do the exercise of thinking how what they say resonates with your lived experience, with your work relating to diverse and community economies, so we can have a good, interesting conversation afterwards about these things. And that's it. Welcome, Kathrin and Kuba.
Oh yeah, good morning.
Hello.
Aviv, thank you so much. You made me feel calmer. The tech keynote makes me really nervous, and I don't want to be there. And I think thanks for reminding us all that this is a place of shared practice and shared thinking. And I think in that spirit, I'm going to enjoy the next 90 minutes. Thanks for this. PowerPoint presentations are not my friend. So but Kuba and I have we have a presentation of about 45 minutes. We're gonna go through it together. We're gonna introduce ourselves. And Kuba, I stop in a minute. Kuba and myself recognize that art is kind of a niche, so thanks for coming here. We're of course trying to draw quite direct parallels to economic practice, community economies practices, and also entrepreneurship towards the end. So Aviv, thank you for this invitation to think about how can it resonate. And I think our big aim is really to have art leave its ivory tower and just become one of many practices to change this world.
As you can see, we are possibly now catching waits for me to jump in. This is the first time that we do this particular lecture, so we do not have it like super well rehearsed, but bear with us. We will try to do our best. Also, not only PowerPoints are not maybe our best friends. I mean, they kind of are because we use them all the time. But like even if you are well acquainted with someone, doesn't mean that you are the best friend with this person. And here we have to deal with this kind of like, let's say, remote control in which Kathrin has a slide. You have a slide controller, but we are going to talk both to this presentation. So what we want to do, or maybe like just to kind of briefly outline the plan for what we are going to do, is that first we are going to shortly introduce ourselves, so that you know from where we are coming from, and then talk about both, let's say, economies of contemporary art, and also about, but treating it, as Kathrin said, as one of many ways how you can organize yourself. So it's a kind of example of certain mode of organization, but also like trying to maybe not assuming that everybody is very well acquainted with this super weird economies of contemporary art. We will talk about it a bit longer later, but also like not only focus on ways of organizing, but also what can be done. So that like what is both in terms of aesthetics and in terms of economies. We will use one of the graphs that Center for Plausible Economies made. I think that we presented it already last year at the Ljubljana conference. We will talk about it a bit later. And using this graph, we will talk about both kind of mainstream art world, capitalocentric art world, and more commoning related or commoning based alternatives. So our kind of like, let's say, main questions here that we would like to present to you, or like maybe pose it as a sort of, actually like before it was better for me, Kathrin, because if you do not mind, yeah, because then at least, I see where we are. But then me and many, this is like the next slide, as you shifted to it, that was good. Sorry, we will need to go through it in this way. So like, what are the kind of economic realities of contemporary art worlds? And art worlds, like this S is very important, but because we believe, just as community economies, I guess, or like diverse economies, credo is that there is like a world beyond or beneath this kind of capitalocentric economy. Does we believe that, well, like what is being seen as a kind of mainstream art world is just one of many art worlds. And then what are the commons-based alternatives to this mainstream capitalocentric art world? How can we work differently and more interdependently? How does the ways we organize influence the ways we think about and make art?
Can I just ask if everybody can see the slides okay? Because I'm using a PDF. You see the full, okay, because I only see half of it.
I mean, like now, I think it's really good now.
Okay, cool. So Kuba, you're introducing yourselves first, yeah?
Yeah, let me introduce myself first very briefly. So one of the, basically I come, on the one hand, I'm very, not very, maybe like just active as a curator, organizer. I also like established many different self-organized artistic institutions and pata institutions or collectives. And I've worked for many years as an independent curator, jumping from project to project, doing many projects in the same time, always thinking about what to do next. This is a kind of condition that is shared by many in this precarious art and academia. And just to make it very brief, some of my reflections that sprang out of this practice are encapsulated in this book, ABC of Projectariat, Living and Working in a Precarious Art World. It states with A's for aftermath, finishes with why you are not alone. Just like Aviv said at the beginning, in the between, it goes through applications, deadlines, enthusiasm, interdependence, independence, and different many aspects of this kind of existence. Maybe next slide. And this analysis is built on many years of engagement also with artistic trade unions. So basically people who try, mostly in Poland, but also abroad, who struggle for the betterment of the conditions of work and practice in contemporary art. Next slide. Because statistics are brutal, you possibly, maybe you are, maybe you aren't aware, even though artists kind of like typically you think about them as a kind of like a rather privileged group. Typically they earn below the minimum wage, or the, you know, like the statistics in Poland are like this, that people, let's say, spend about 50, 60 hours in work every week, which basically is an equivalent of the full-time job. And yet they typically earn much below the minimum wage. So for example, a typical wage of a painter, or like a kind of earning, because they are not waged employers in Poland, would be, when they declare the income, would be 600 or 700 euros, right? So this is like, and the medium wage in Poland is like about, not minimum wage in Poland is about 1,200 euros. And these statistics are quite similar in many other Western countries and or Central European. So maybe next slide. But then I will not, you know, we will not. I mean, I will focus a bit on this poverty of artists, but like not to whine too much about that, because there's a kind of like evergreen topic. People, when you know, a couple of artists come together, or especially precarious artists, they always like to discuss a lot, like how. Yeah, like the dire straits in which they are. But then I think that also there are like a lot of examples of like magnificent examples of self-organization, talking about the depressing mode in which we are. The things that we are going to say is also based on the kind of practice of self-organized collectives such as Office for Post-Artistic Services. It is an art activist group that operated in Poland and still operates in Poland for the last decade. As you may be aware, in Poland we went through also this authoritarian turn in politics, which is basically ultra masculine, anti-feminist, anti-queer, anti-migrant, and so on. And then, yet miraculously, let's say, last October, there was a change for better with democratic opposition winning elections. But the groups such as ours, such as Office for Post-Artistic Services, operated in this hostile environment, trying to both voice kind of concern or simply protest the policies that we encountered. Kathrin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I briefly introduce myself. I've trained as an artist. I still keep calling myself an artist. A lot of friends really ask me, why are you doing this? Obviously, I've worked outside of the kind of institutional art space throughout my career. So it's always been in collaboration, in public, and art in use. And I often use everyday formats to practice as an artist. So it's less about making art, but it's about enjoying, but also sharing the kind of privileges that art still holds in terms of offering a space for experiment, freedom, and the privilege to not always have to think efficiently and commercially. So one of the projects, which is also quite well known in this network, is Company Drinks. It was set up in 2014 by myself through an arts grant as a drinks enterprise, as a community drinks enterprise, where the whole process of making drinks becomes a commons, where each moment of the production cycle becomes a public moment. So my work in that sense is very much about creating new public realms where we meet with communities we normally probably wouldn't meet, and to have both a kind of very productive and reproductive aspect to the work. So Company Drinks has now been going for 10 years. It's become many different things for many different people. For me, it's still art practice. For others, it's a social enterprise, a cultural enterprise, a tool for social change, and so on. So it has this ambiguity, which it has lived for a long time. And as the statement says, like the seasons, Company Drinks is changed by those involved. So it's both an experiment, but it's also a reality in which we test, establish, review, change, adapt through practice. So the C as Company Drinks, but also community or community economies or communism or collectivity is practiced throughout. And those are just two small examples of how we also connect to the community economies network. One is a label for drink, which we made last year, where we kind of also try to communicate and on an everyday basis use this idea of diverse economies, use this kind of much broader idea of we are all economic actors, including the non-human, and how does that allow us to sustain what we want to do. And you see the tablecloth again with the centering community, which now over 10 years has become the kind of shared aim of all those people who are involved. And the second example I wanted to show you is to introduce myself is the Rural School of Economics, which I set up with Kuba Szreder from my villages in 2019. And it kind of builds on other translocal forms of informal learning, where again, many CERN members have been part of. And it's a platform, it's an infrastructure to look much more closely at like rural practices and the meaning of the rural in thinking our futures. So we recognize that we, of course, work with a binary term of the rural within a kind of European context, but still want to look at the particularities of rural practices, rural economies, rural mindsets that exist both in rural and urban situations. So it's more about claiming back, it's about critiquing urban cultural hegemony, especially in the arts. Like there's no culture out there, we've all heard that. And it's also to de-urbanize the museum. And you can, I think all those links are in the presentation, so you can dive deeper. And just as an example, the projects themselves are incredibly localized. That's a recent work by Kuba Szreder for the Soils exhibition at Van Abbe, which very closely works with dairy farmers to represent realities of today's farming within an art context. And we also had a vending machine where we sell products. So the work is always has a very kind of representative and presentational mode, but also very hands-on mode of selling, trading, making things very tangible. So that's about me. And then just looking at the time, Kuba and myself have been speaking for a long, long time about how to work together. And then in 2019, set up what we call the Center for Plausible Economies. It's connected to Company Drinks. And we launched it in 2018 as part of a CERN workshop. You can recognize some people on the photos there. As a platform to really think and imagine economies in the arts and beyond. Kuba?
Well, maybe you can follow like still the next slide with IDT.
Yeah. So just to briefly introduce a few initiatives, a few ideas that have come out of this bigger network and discussions. One was the IDT. It came during CERN summer gathering in Rovereto in 2019. And it's important for today's presentation because it's addressing this, it's addressing the scale of who we are. We know there's many, we know we all do super important work, but this ubiquity, thanks Catherine Gibson for that word, I can pronounce it by now. The ubiquity of our practice is there, but not necessarily visible. So in 2019, this idea of using an identifier, the IDT, instead of, say, the limited or the incorporated, as a way of sharing and showing our shared practice came about. And you can see the logo on the right-hand side, the IDT. And of course, that already hints to the presentation later, this idea of interdependent practices. And just as a last example for the work we do with CPE, it's also often curatorial. It's raising this issue that art practice, cultural work can and should be read as economic practice, because with whatever we do, we subvert or support existing systems. That's not always clear to artists. There's still, you know, this romantic idea that art and economy, you know, one is good, one is bad, we're not touching it. So we think it's very, very crucial to think within an art context, a cultural discourse about economic practices that we support or subvert with whatever we do. And last year we co-curated an exhibition in Manchester, quite a big exhibition, that exclusively showed art as economic practice, which is a different reading of art, and a very important reading of art. And we also had a kind of redrawing room, a big drawing room, where this idea of, well, if we can't imagine other futures, other economies, they might not happen. So the idea of visualizing, using the iceberg, using other images that allow us to have a clear understanding of where we want to move towards. So this redrawing room was one part of the curatorial contribution. And now I hand over to Kuba, to the coin we want to use for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you, Kathrin. So one of the graphs that we did, because this redrawing room was it was a central space in the exhibition, but that hosted many different drawings, including the iceberg, but also more mainstream drawings of economies and like alternatives. And but before we did this, we mount this redrawing room, we conducted a series of redrawing exercises, basically workshops with the museum, with the Whitworth in Manchester, with its team, that aimed at visualizing different economic models that are already operational in contemporary art. And and one of the graphs that we did was this drawing of artistic economies as a coin that you can flip. This is basically, and this is an idea that artistic institutions, like to the left, we have a kind of, let's say, we called it a museum of 1%. To the right, kind of a museum of the commons or institution of the commons. Maybe we can shift. But you basically can flip it. So first, I'm going to start. So, but basically, every existing institution is not really faced with an alternative, but it's rather that embeds both logics inside of its kind of institutional practice, and can either emphasize one or another. Because with flipping the coins, there is always there is also an alternative that we wanted to pose, that we wanted to emphasize, that as an institution or as people who are modeling it and who are kind of reproducing its logics, but also shaping it, you have an influence, you face an alternative, because in contemporary art, just like as is in mainstream economy, there is this conviction that the mainstream model is the only operational model and all the alternatives are basically not really viable. So I will actually start with this kind of, let's say, with the analysis of the mainstream logic of contemporary art, in which Museum of 1% uses its collections exhibitions to change art into luxury, fuel a speculative and exploitative economy, bolstering prestige of private patrons and weakening cultural democracy. And what we wanted to, this is a kind of, let's say, what museum does. In a couple, it's a very brief and of course very general couple of statements. It's much more complicated than that, but we wanted to have a graph. It was presented on the wall, right? Which could be read in a couple of seconds, like I did it here now, and that would be kind of clear in a sense that not really nuanced, but rather extracting certain type of logic in order to present it to the public. And what was also important in this model, why the coin here, is that when we think about art in Center for Plausible Economies, we think about a connection between ways of organizing, ways of doing, and the kind of what happens with the very art. What art is, how you make it, and what you present at the end, right? So here, in this kind of model, art is being privatized. So art becomes a speculative asset. Art becomes a status symbol. Art becomes a commodity. Art becomes an instrument of gentrification, and art is being removed from the many. But this is not what art is. Art rather becomes all these things when it is being said within this type of organizational, institutional logic. So maybe next slide. So basically, what is very important to emphasize is that the global art world is one of the most unequal, unregulated, and exploitative social worlds, right? People, when you think about art, you typically think about it as a realm of beauty, kind of, not very economic, that artists commit themselves to the pursuits out of the love of art. Collectors collect because they love art. Millions of people flock to museums such as Guggenheim because of the love of art. There is this kind of, like, in Western societies, there is this very bourgeois idea as art as a realm of kind of economic exceptionalism, while in fact artistic economies are extremely cruel. Maybe next is that. So the peak of artistic iceberg is an art world for the 1%, which is built on a close alliance with the global plutocracy. But even on a micro scale of a kind of, let's say, individual practice, privileges play an enormous role when it comes to limiting access, when it comes to determining who is able to afford art. Like I told you a bit about the statistics at the beginning, right? So if you cannot earn even a minimum wage, art becomes, or like if you cannot basically make money with art becomes a privilege based on class, race, based on gender, and so on and so forth. I could really go on and on and on about it, but this is not about it. Let's maybe move on. And in order to understand these cruel economies of art, it is important we have one essay that is called Icebergian Economies of Contemporary Art, that we are actually pretty happy with this both title and an essay. It's a visual essay that basically tries to depict these economies, and we use here as a visual reference. We use images from this essay, because it's very important to note that what happens at the very top of this art world is really just a small peak of much larger whole. So we have this kind of what shines, let's say here, what is set in the limelight, right? You think about art, you think biennale. You think about art, you think Tate. You think about art, you think $150 million paid for this or that artwork in Sotheby's or any other auction house. But this is a very, very tiny sliver. Possibly it's even less, statistically speaking, is much less than 1% of what actually happens inside of the art world, or inside of the artistic universe, if we think about it, as composed of many art worlds, of many layers, of many different practices that contribute to the thing that we call art. So you think about, let's say, you can think about local enthusiasm, Sunday painters. You can think about art activists, but you can think about people who flock to art schools. You can think about people who are going to all this, who are organizing self-organized galleries, but also who are simply trying to make ends meet. They just paint, they try to find a gallery. They are located somewhere in Płock, which is a small town in Poland, and not in London or in New York, right? They just basically, they do art, they commit to it, and yet they are never exhibited at the top tier of this tiny sliver. They may be invisible, and yet their daily labors contribute to the reproduction of the social universe. And this is the argument that is made by Greg Chollet, a super interesting thinker and also an artist who is based in New York, who borrows this metaphor from astrophysics, the metaphor of artistic dark matter. And his argument is like this. It's very similar, I think, in its premise to the feminist take on diverse economies of capitalism. That's why we actually, I think that's why there is this theoretical and intellectual alliance between CERN and CPE, and because our understanding and Greg's understanding of artistic universe is very similar to how diverse economies understand capitalism. So the argument goes like this. We have this kind of we have what shines, we have these art stars, art celebrities, these large events. It is just a small part of the larger whole, just like in astrophysics. What shines, what reflects light, is just a part of universe, right? Because in astrophysics, dark matter is a kind of hypothesis that explains why universe basically stays together. And they say, astrophysicists say that there is a lot of this matter that simply does not shine, is not being registered by our senses and by our sensory equipments. And Greg Scholet uses this metaphor to explain how art operates, saying, well, what you see is just a small part of the much larger whole. But also this argument is, in this argument, the very important aspect of this argument is that what you do not see is important, or like all this labor, all these people, the daily effort, the daily toil is necessary for the reproduction of the social universe. So they are not seen, they are not respected. Any other labor is extremely important, just as it is with all this, let's say, non-monetized aspects of capitalist economies, such as care labor, which is extremely important for the maintenance of economy as such, and yet it is not registered as economic by the mainstream modes of monetization, let's say, and exploitation. So maybe once again, just to hammer this point down, that the vast majority of artists remain poor, even in countries with a developed art market. This is a very important argument. So art market basically contributes to the poverty of artists rather than resolves it. Because there is a typical argument in semi-periphery countries such as Poland, or possibly elsewhere as well, but only as if we were like London, only as if we were like New York, only as if we had all these very wealthy patrons, very wealthy collectors, all would be good, right? So if there was more money going to the market, it would solve all the problems with poverty of arts. Well, we know from New York, we know from London that this is not the case. Basically, this market is based on a winner's take it all economy, which is based on huge inequalities. What does it mean is that you may have $150 million paid for one painting, but then you have 150,000 artists who do not make a penny. And in this cruel economy of art, just as in capitalist economy, this may be also important to emphasize, is that visibility is this kind of social economic form of visibility, appreciation, recognition, symbolic capital, lack thereof, like if you make something invisible, is also one helps to exploit it, to extract labor by making something unregistered as important, like for example care labor of a woman, or like important in economic sense. It's much easier to basically exploit it. The same is in the art world. Like a lot of people are being paid not in real money, but are being paid in the promises of access and promises of reputation. So if you are an artist, you often are invited. But also in academia, I think it's kind of like, but this is a different thing. Let's say, let's focus on art. If you are an artist, you are often invited to exhibitions, and the economies are not completely talked about. So economies in a sense of money, like nobody wants to pay you anything, under the premise that you basically do it because you are going to be more visible, but they are going to platform your work, that you are out there, and institution is able in this way to extract free services from content providers. The last one, and this is the last slide of this part, However, just as in community economies, of course, artists and curators, other art workers, cultural producers are not just hapless victims of the economies at play. They have many coping strategies. They just try to create this kind of networks of sustenance. This is one of the graphs that came out of the exercises that Kathrin conducted, right, in the Barking as part of the kind of using this redrawing the type of methodology to help artists understand how they actually cope with this cruel economy, right? How they manage, and they typically manage by spreading a quite vast network of basically constituted by jobs, by family support, by free infrastructures, by self-help, by mutual help to keep them going, very diverse. And then also by establishing collective commons-based support structures, about which I think Kathrin is going to talk.
Okay, thanks, Kuba. So let's flip the coin. Yeah, you've seen this graph now, and my part will focus more on art practice that actively revests, that is very active and aware of it being also an important economic practice, and towards what are we revesting instead of further investing in the privatization of art. So commoning art is a term we use, and it really is the flip side of making art exclusive. It's the flip side of using the collections and exhibitions for the few. We're using the term constituent museum here, which was it's not so more, but it has been quite the term, let's say, at least within our European discourse, of museums clearly positioning themselves as community-led, as in community use, rather than market-led and for the use of collectors. So the Whitworth, where the exhibition was at the time, claimed for itself to be this constituent museum, to move towards that. And with that, you automatically, of course, use, distribute and redistribute your resources very, very differently. And I think this very simple acknowledgement of that it's possible that there is an alternative might be very obvious to many of us, but shockingly, it's not always that obvious once you're in institutions, because certain patterns are so set that you almost become unaware of what you're supporting with your action. So yeah, for the exhibition, this was the focus, this idea of revestment. How can we use the resources and redistribute them towards community economy, solidarity economies, and the commons. And I quickly want to introduce this idea of an organizational turn in the arts. And that's kind of, I'm kind of like moving towards an argument where I also want to talk about the relationship between art and enterprise, or art and business. And I think that's from my position of teaching at a business management school, where there's still the assumption that art will somehow make people more creative, create a bit of like a playing ground, become this like additional thing that makes the existing systems run more efficiently and more smoothly. So I want to move to an argument where I want to talk about cultural entrepreneurship. I know that the word entrepreneurship is critical, but bear with me. I basically want to dissolve this idea that art and economy have to come together, but that they're both emancipatory practices that probably share more similarities than we imagine. So this organizational turn in the art is very important, because we are less foregrounding what art produces or what artists make, but the question of like, how do we organize ourselves? Why do we do what we do? And who with are being foregrounded? And I want to root this also in examples of quite large global associations, networks, affiliations, which clearly move away from this producing the object to actually taking the self-organization as the practice that's important. So there's ubiquity is our scale, scaling out and across. And I'm going to show a few examples who are trying to do this. I'm referring to the Penfold principles that Kuba and myself first started to write in 2021. And I'm using them not just for the talk, but for ourselves in general as a compass. What are we working towards? And how are we organizing ourselves inwards within the organizations or initiatives we are setting up, we are co-running, and how do we communicate? What do we want towards the outwards, the kind of larger political? Just to introduce them so you know what I'm referring to. I'm using one page from the Penfold principle, which talks about aesthetics and art, and that's important for understanding the examples I'm using. We're, of course, working with a very open and inclusive idea of what art is. Art is a self-defined, self-identified thing. But within the art words that Kuba just mentioned, and just by looking at statistics, the art that still reaches the highest price is oil painting and bronze sculpture. So we haven't moved very far. So even though art can be anything, the market focuses on quite a small possibility of it. So in the Penfold principles and within the wider networks and communities, there's a clear understanding that we're talking about cultural democracy, that art is one of many forms of cultural expression, and that art doesn't have to have a specific style. It's made by many. It's not glossy, it's everything that Kuba showed earlier. And it's not whether someone decides it is art, it's a kind of self-decided, you decide whether what you're doing is art or not. It's part of the everyday. And I think one important aspect here is the word usership, which for us is a very useful term to think about a different role of art. So it's not an art that traditionally we kind of look at, which is defined by spectatorship, but which gets much more defined by its usership. What can it be used for? Who is using it? And has a completely different porousness and openness about what it can be and who can use it for what. So there's a big list and much longer than this of collectives, many of them also affiliated with the Community Economies Institute, who see their artwork as commons-based practice, as community economies, as solidarity economies. And the term that was very important for many of us was Lumbung, the term that was used by Ruan Grupa to name the last documenta. I'm showing it in a few seconds. So I just want to make this argument a bit that this ubiquity is there. I'm aware that, you know, even our keynote is a bit of a niche to look at art in terms of this movement. But I wanted to point out a few, which maybe some of you know already. Art Co-op, Carolyn Woolard, who's also part of the CERN network, with a larger collective, are very proactively claiming that artists are economic innovators. And please go on the website. It's a very impressive movement building to not just claim back art for artists, but also use art for social change and insist on this competence, but also innovation ability of artists to actually create fair and sustainable economies for their own communities and the wider communities. Art Co-op refers to the term solidarity economies. But yeah, please have a look. Please have a look on the website. Another important network, colleagues, peers for us is Arts Collaboratory. Again, by now, a huge translocal global ecosystem of 25 diverse organizations who start to organize global infrastructure to support artists and arts projects that are very localized. And again, this has been growing over the last 10, 15 years, and is again a practice that very carefully thinks about its economics, the inequalities within their geographies, how to use the resources and redistribute them, and clearly acts not just as a movement, but also as a kind of solidarity economy amongst the network. I show a few other examples. The archives of Arte Utile, which refers to this idea of usership in art. You know, if art, as we know it, has reached a certain redundancy, how can we move beyond this redundancy? And this is Tanya Bruguera, who also promotes this idea of let's use it. Again, you can go on the website. It's a big international network of practices that share those Arte Utile principles, you know, art clearly towards social change within a purpose within society and so on. And this is just a very nice example, maybe just to give a little anecdote. You know, since Duchamp, we all know that art can be anything. It can be the pissoir, it can be the ready-made object. And Tanya Bruguera quite famously moved this very everyday object, which has become a classic of like modern art in museums, out from the collection and back into the toilet, male toilets at Van Appe Museum. So there's also, of course, always a materiality attached to these practices, but overall, they're more about organizing, self-organizing, gaining visibility and recognition. And that's a project from that Kuba is actively involved in Poland, the Atlas of the Anti-Fascist Art. So those are just very few of many examples where artists actively reorganize not just the topics and the networks, but also the economics around them. And Lumbung Documenta 15, which don't know, many of you might know because it has been discussed in this network as well. Lumbung Documenta 15 was an incredibly important moment, not only because Documenta is seen or widely regarded as this quite, let's say, trend-setting global event every 5 years, but it was the first Documenta that was organized differently to what Kuba described earlier. It was organized by a collective, not by a single artist. So it completely threw out of the window this idea of like single authorship, important curator. But what Lumbung, which was organized by Ruang Grupa, a collective from Jakarta, what was most important about this so-called exhibition was that they didn't organize it as an exhibition, but as practice. And it's a very fine difference between showing something or showing the practice of something. So Ruang Grupa insisted that Lumbung Documenta was organized around the principles of the Lumbung, an Indonesian term for a shared rice barn, a commons where resources are generated, looked after, and redistributed collectively. And Lumbung, in that sense, was organized away from the market. It was self-organized. And the budget, which is not a small one because it's seen as such a global event, was used and seen as seed funding to bring together and sustain a kind of global translocal network of practitioners who work locally. And the 100 Days of Documenta were a kind of window into their practice rather than a durational exhibition that costs money and then is closed down. So Lumbung Documenta, and I spent a bit more time on explaining this, was extremely important for the art world we are in because it practiced different economic principles on a very large global scale. A few more minutes. And again, as I said, Lumbung was less about showing the what is being done, but practicing how things are done together, which of course always result in things, exhibitions, spaces, gatherings, and so on. But this idea of artists, cultural workers tending towards organizational concerns and therefore economic concerns, I want to highlight two people here, Chunlin Go, who's for me like an important colleague and person who voices those things in saying, as artists, through building enterprises, through building businesses, we have the capacity to build different worlds in our current one. That is, of course, very close to the CEI and our idea, take back the economy, we are sharing in this room. And I wanted to point out a second, in my opinion, very interesting recent essay, which compares art to histories of entrepreneurship. And in this, did Philstrop Holm and Timon Bayes make a very intriguing argument that both entrepreneurship and the development and history of art over the last 30 years have shared very similar ambitions and concerns, from becoming more social, to becoming more relational, to becoming more participatory, to becoming more institutional, and so on. It would be too, I don't have enough time to go into this essay. I'm very happy to share it, because for me, as someone who's teaching in a business management school, I'm less interested in like drawing a division between what art can do and what business can do, but to look at what are the kind of shared and emancipatory moments and propositions that both bring. And we're probably moving with an organizational turn in the arts and with a non-for-profit turn in business to a new, I don't even know if it's a new interdisciplinary form, but maybe just a new form of practice where the cultural and the political side of organizing economics or becoming entrepreneurial merge beyond this division, art and business. So quickly going back towards our compass, which will guide me through the last 3 minutes. In the compass for interdependent art worlds, we describe 7 key terms and how we want to use them as cultural organizers and artists. One is the economy, of course, following closely the call of this network to take it back. And towards the inwards, we are creating support structures that nurture us. And towards the outwards, we insist on like post-capitalist forms of economies like the commons. Again, I can share a PDF of this if it's of interest. And another term, we had the term aesthetics, the term economy, the last term is politics. Again, the way we use the compass is to inwardly towards the initiatives and networks we are actively part of, clearly organize ourselves around solidarity economies and principles of solidarity, and in wider politics, of course, ask for post-capitalism, post-capitalist reality. So we see ourselves, maybe coming back to this ubiquity, a small outpost for a post-capitalist world. And I hope what Kuba and I myself could kind of describe and explain in this session was that we are both interested in reading art and cultural practice differently, not as a kind of like other, some people do art, but as a new way of working and thinking together, to take back the economy both as a cultural and political realm. Kuba, do you want to say something before you share the last slide? So our optimism, which is very dim today, is still to like heads up, hands on, focus on what we can do within the resources, abilities, and privileges that we have. And I think I stop sharing here and want to thank everyone for listening to us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you. A lot of applause. It would be good to get some questions. I don't know if people want to take a quick break and then go back into questions?
I mean, maybe
Uh,
one comment. We are, of course, extremely interested in, like, within this group, if people know of other networks we should be aware of, you know, other art-led, artist-led businesses, networks that are not on our radar or list. So we would love to hear them or put them in the chat so we become aware of other practices as well.
do people want to take a 5-minute break just to refresh themselves, or should we just continue? Any thoughts? Yes, a quick break. Okay. Let's rejoin here in 5 minutes, whatever the time is, wherever you are, if that's all right with you. Hi, Kathrin.
I didn't know what time we stopped. I don't
I
know
think we
when
still have 1 more minute.
Oh, 1 more minute. Okay.
We are here. So
Yes. Cool.
The most important people. Great.
So let's wait 1 more minute. If you're all right. Or whatever is left of this minute. Okay. Shall we start with questions? People have their camera off, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not here, does it?
Looks like Ligia has a question, Aviv.
Ah, where? I don't see it.
she just rose her hand.
Hello.
The hand up.
Virtual.
Yeah.
So please go ahead, Ligia.
Yeah. Yeah, I could speak about this topic for hours. This is a topic that really interests me because I experience both these both fields, as some people already know that I'm an economist and also an artist. So inside my brain, I have always these these two people talking with each other and exchanging ideas. I had a few comments and then a question. Just regarding the market of art, which is a huge topic in itself. But I think when we think about market of art, and especially this 1%, also one thing that sometimes I often see missing in a presentation, and I think is quite important to understand, it's like the idea of speculation of art and art as currency, like as a monetary, it has a monetary aspect to it. So of course these distortions in the market of art that winner takes all, it's just also highly connected to the fact that art is seen as a form of currency, and therefore, and because it's subjective, then it's a very good tool also to create financial speculation around it. So it's a highly distorted, the market is a highly distorted way to bring art for artists to work with also through that. And also the concept of externality, of positive externality, in that sense that when an artist does a work, it's usually all the cost of production, all the effort of producing is centralized in the artist, even if it's not a collective but one person. But the value of the artwork is distributed over time and through several people. You create a new way of thinking, you create an image, you create a dialogue. So it's very difficult, again, for the market to understand these dynamics and to solve it. That's why also the Commons create a framework that allows this type of redistributions and ways of create conditions of working a bit better than perhaps the market could do it. My other question is regarding this dialogue between art and rethinking the economy. because I practiced economy and I studied economy for about 10 years, and then I started to study art, and I realized I suddenly started to ask questions about the economy because I had this art background. And suddenly I said, oh, but I actually can rethink the system. Why didn't I? Because in economic school, usually you are never, we speak about innovation, for instance, but we speak about product innovation or innovation for a business idea, but you never talk about innovation for system, for the economic system behind. And I find this very difficult to bring this discussion. Actually, I find it very hard since I started to study art. I think I was never seen again as an economist. I was never given opportunity to present that, even although I tried several times to create a discussion about economy in my university. And I've been invited to speak in so many different occasions, but it has been extremely hard to create a discussion about economics from the standpoint of, actually, I know economics, I know the language, but now I'm seen as an artist, so my knowledge is not received. So I have question about how can we create this dialogue? I think there is an invalidation of the artist in that sense. And for me, it's like, but I know, and I come from this background. So how do you create this dialogue, and how you create this kind of thinking which is a bit more open and experimental towards economics? Sorry, it was a bit long, but
is it Kuba? Is it okay if I continue?
I'll add something maybe to the comment, but later. First, maybe you can start because I think it's a super interesting question here.
But thanks for sharing this, and also thanks for sharing this like split role, you know, that we as persons want to bring together, but as soon as you say the one word, no one is taking you seriously anymore. I mean, I've taken a lot of strengths from this network, from the writing of J.K. Gibson Graham, that I can just declare myself an economic actor. Yeah, and I've been, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, so I have competence. My colleagues might not recognize that. I'm luckily in a department where I only have like one really. Anyway, let's not go down there today. He really pissed me off yesterday. Anyway, but I think it's this confidence of accepting and acknowledging this role. And of course, my knowledge is only to a degree. I'm not an economist, but I can still claim that what I do is a cultural practice and is concerned with how we distribute and redistribute things, which is economic systems. So I think it's this confidence I gain a lot from this network. You know, it's not a specialized subject, however much the specialists want to keep it a specialized subject. So I think it's a cultural enabling, you know, it's an enabling of, and then for confidence building, we need small groups where we share some good arguments to counter quite quickly, because it's very aggressive, not being taken seriously in that context. Teaching at a business school, my main aim is really to not have art as this like additional training that makes the current economy better. I honestly, like, social innovation once more and I'm done. Yeah. So my main teaching aim is to look at art as economic practice, not necessarily as better, but maybe in terms of more freedom, in terms of experimenting. Yeah, we look at like CRTPC, we look at Lumbung, we look at quite large-scale practices that prove that other systems can also work, but initiated through artists. And then what I'm also, I have a little names list of kind of quite influential business people who would in public say art is important. And art is not important on a decorative level or on a provocational level, but art is important on an operational level. So I think it's also building those allyships where, because as an artist, you can argue forever, to also like build those little allyships with people who have this like authority in business, but who are very close to my thinking or our thinking.
Maybe just to, if I may, two things, you know, I think that also talking about art, right? Like there is this idea, I mean, like this, I think goes in both directions, right? So in contemporary art, it is still, and definitely in modern art, it is still a taboo to talk about money in a sense. I mean, it is based on a very weird idea. On the one hand, there is a lot of money, so people like, money plays an important role, like also as a setting as kind of signifier of value, which is quite a new thing. So you think that like, some art becomes exhibited because it's so expensive. I mean, like this is like, there is a kind of like an interesting relationship between the prices that are being fetched and the exhibitionary policies of larger institutions, so to speak, right? And also like how market is being appreciated, not only for its price, but also as a value, as a kind of like good art simply. But then on the other hand, there is a reluctance to discuss money stuff when you, for example, talk with an institution, right? Like you negotiate with a museum, and there is there is an assumption that you shouldn't actually really talk about money. You shouldn't talk about how much fees you get. This is a kind of like a shameful aspect of this practice. Like a kind of open negotiations of a kind of economic matters, especially at the kind of like, at the vantage point of artistic labor, are still quite uncommon. Or at least, this is something that needs to be somehow breached. There is this aggression that you said about Kathrin, right? But like it's disregarded in a sense. And if it is regarded, it is regarded in a very mainstream way, right? So you just think about it's taken for granted that an artist is a sort of, let's say, an atomized individual who, for example, needs to compete with others for attention and to fetch a better position in this kind of weird universe. In this sense that, for example, it's about, okay, so how you create your portfolio, how you should write application, how you should present yourself to curators, how to organize a studio visit, So if you think about this kind of know-how, it is usually about how to feed into this very, very narrow understanding of what an artistic career is. So if you have a kind of, let's say, professional rising, professional kind of courses at the universities, artistic academies, that are typically about that, right? So how you find yourself in this ultra competitive environment. While I think like what I also try to do in art academy is rather to present to students this understanding that there's many different options, right? This kind of diverse, community-driven, interdependent options of how you can organize yourself. And also that the money talk is an important talk, right? It's not about economics as a science. It's a very rudimentary, basic understanding of the necessary to manage yourself, to organize, while not kind of following this type of mainstream understanding of what it is. Because like responding to your first comment, of course, I agree. There are many different markets, and art market is just like, we say art, and art can mean so many different things, right? Like Kathrin said, art may mean like, a painting sold, like abstract expressionist painting sold by 150 millions and exhibited at MoMA. Art, it may be community art workshops organized somewhere, or art may be a landscape painting that is made by a local artist, like even like, magnificent in terms of technique, and yet disregarded in terms of like its exhibition and monetary value, right? So art is like a lot of different things. It has its market. So like in Poland, the most common prize that people actually, it was a couple of years ago, but people received for the artworks, it was, I think, 250 euros, the most common, right? So like it was, and so of course, so it basically means that they sell it to their families, they sell it to their friends, they basically get a bit of money for just simply fetching this object. And I don't have anything against it, right? I mean, this what I did was very schematic, in a sense of like simply really presenting this tiny sliver of what art is, because also it is so powerful in terms of organizing our imagination about what art is and what it can be. It limits perspectives, it limits our imagination in a very, like just as capitalocentric visions of economy also do the same to our understanding of what economy, what social life maybe. And maybe the last note is about, you use the word externalities, and this is a very interesting thing, of course, when it comes to individual practice. So like you produce an object, and it may be like this is a fate of many female artists, right? Like there is this saying that you sell well when you're dead, right? Especially when you're a woman artist. So that there is this kind of situation in which you have like a body of work, let's say from 70s, 80s, and then it is becoming rediscovered. Maybe like, galleries operate with the estates of an artist, with inheritors, and it sells well just 30 or 40 years. And there's people like, a typical Van Gogh situation, but, you can name like a lot of female artists, especially currently. They are considered to be this kind of resource to be found, repackaged, and placed on the market. And the only agents that make money on it are the ones who are actually galleries who put it on the market, right? And then maybe speculators in a sense, like in a secondary, speculators not necessarily, but let's say in a secondary art markets, and then which is basically auction related, they can also realize this financial value, right? They can extract it out of what was basically non-monetized when artists were alive, right? And became valuable as an item, as a token, as a currency, like you said, after like a couple of decades, right? But this is an externality when it comes to individual trajectory, but we can also talk about externalities when it comes to collective but more dispersed understanding of artistic styles and so on. So for example, right, you may have there are maybe one or two Polish artists, like, who sell well on the kind of international art market, maybe 15, maybe 10, out of, let's say, 15,000 living Polish visual artists, right? All these people create certain type of styles. They create a niveau in which these styles are being distributed, kind of coined, shaped. They create a community in which without which art cannot function. And yet, like the money flows mostly to this couple of artists who are at the very, very top of the pyramid, and a couple of galleries who regulate access to the global markets, because that's where, or like also to local, but that's where money typically is. So this externality plays an extremely important role, and that's why commons related or diverse economies are so useful to understand how this weird economy operates.
Thank you.
Any other hands of questions? If not, I'll ask a question. Maybe I'll ask a question, comment. So yesterday we found out that I don't know the exact number, but many millions of Americans voted for Donald Trump. For me, it just reinforced the idea that a lot of people who want to, I don't know, to create all sorts of diverse alternatives, political, economical, we all need to somehow step out of our comfort zones and kind of be more, I don't know, more aware in our lived experience. What is the lived experience of someone who's angry enough to do such a thing? That's how I'm imagining it. That's what I see around me in the neighborhood where I live, and so I want to use that as kind of an urgency to connect some of the conceptual stuff you were talking about to the lived experience of your work. And I was I'm interested in hearing about, because the way I see it, you're kind of reframing the question of art. You're challenging the boundaries of this question, because these boundaries between there's art and then there's non-art, there's artists and then there's non-artists. These are kind of all being challenged by the work you're doing. So my question has to do with specifically with the work you've been doing in Barking, in that neighborhood of London. I'm interested in hearing how this conceptual reframing of these boundaries between art and the world, like art world with the art crossed out, like your slideshow. How is that experience of working in a neighborhood like Barking? I'm interested to hearing about your lived experience of your own comfort zones in working in a space like that, because I think that's useful. That's a useful kind of embodiment of this more conceptual kind of framing that you've been doing, and since you've had that experience, I think it's something that's interesting to hear about.
That's towards me, Aviv.
Yes, mostly towards you, I guess, because I mean,
I can say
last
something.
time I met Kuba, it was embarking as well, but
Yeah, I can, but Kathrin,
no,
please
I
start.
or similar spaces. Not, I mean, barking is just because that's where I met you both last. But
I can say something about barking, you know, because it started as an arts commission with a budget, and the budget was used from year one to make it multi-year. Yeah, so that was a very simple thing in the beginning, to not spend the money on one commission for 1 year, but to keep half of it with the intention to make it long-term. The C, as I said, can stand for many different things. You know, for me, it's contemporary practice. I'm in a minority in the wider community of company drinks who is interested in this as art practice. I think it is recognized that it comes from a cultural intention. You know, there's clear testimony that the way it's organized, it would be different if it would be a straightforward charity, if it would be a straightforward social enterprise. The ambiguity we had from the beginning is something that was unfamiliar, but over the years created quite an interesting public space. So that's acknowledged by a lot of people who are part or connected company drinks, that it's kind of ambiguity, that its openness is quite specific, that it's different to other, let's say, community projects who come with a more straightforward mission or a straightforward blueprint, you know, who are more straightforward charity. We are none of this. We are kind of very ambiguous in that sense. And we are currently in a situation where this ambiguity becomes uncomfortable for some. Yeah. So we are currently in a kind of like organizational restructuring where we're probably going to split or detach the community from the company enterprise side of things. And it's not because it's not working, because in the lived experience of everyone who's actually running it, this ambiguity doesn't make any sense anymore. The kind of ambiguity has allowed company drinks to become very well rooted and really locally liked community space. And the drinks making is kind of an interesting thing and is the kind of beginning of it, but to many it's not really necessary anymore. So in the lived experience, we kind of, the kind of like me as an artist loving those things being ambiguous is not being appreciated by many others. And I think that's a healthy recognizing, and then what you do with it, you know. So I think what Jun Lin also said, it's an experiment, which it's material practice as well, you know. You organize, you reorganize, like, but you always reorganize towards nurturing or enabling something rather than dividing and destroying something. So I think this practice can be sustained even though there's major change. But in terms of lived experience, you know, in the first years, we were quite apolitical. We didn't have a political position as such. We have become much more politically explicit in the last 5 years. Just from the lived experience of living in a neighborhood where, first of all, everybody wanted to leave Europe, not everyone, but 75%. And then in a neighborhood where the BNP and racist statements were quite common. So in those moments, we explicitly became more political, and are acknowledged as that noise one. I think in also the lived experience of, like, even though that's a failure, you know, this idea of how can we be very transparent with our economic underpinnings. I think the fact that we present ourselves as a drinks enterprise, there's some kind of assumption that we make money with that, you know. So that's a kind of conceptual, of course it's interesting that a company can be both social and entrepreneurial, But of course, there's a danger in that people think, okay, the money comes from selling those drinks, and the harshness of the reality is not really transparent.
So I haven't really talked about it because about what we do with this Office for Post-Artistic Services. But if I did, you would see a lot of slides with flags waving and kind of campaigning and marching and organizing summits at the verge of huge open pit mining, because that's what Office does, right? So it's a lot of kind of politically oriented anti-authoritarian art activities that we try to organize with. That's why I mentioned this example at all at Ljubljana conference, because it tries to be organized in this kind of diverse economic way, even if we do not have a lot of money. For example, Anti-Fascist Year had a budget possibly of like a couple of €1,000. You may remember there was one slide which Kathrin showed, which was referencing this database, and this was a kind of event or an umbrella campaign for over 150 events organized throughout entire country in Poland, like in 70 different cities. That was basically a sort of pitch-in based on the kind of pitch-in economy. So it was organized in 2019, 2020 as a kind of counter activity for the official kind of programs related to the round anniversary of the beginning and end of the Second World War, which in Poland was extremely instrumentalized by the authoritarian government to prop up the political agenda. It's like history driven, Poland as a victim, because we are victims, we can do whatever. It's very masculine as well, very militaristic, and so on and so forth. So we organized a series of counter events, and we made an open call. And with a shoestring budget, we managed to gather a coalition, like impromptu coalition of about 70 organizations, and they were both located in larger cities, but also in the smaller regional towns. Sometimes it's even outside of the large townships. And these were workshops, exhibitions, lectures, and so on and so forth, that dealt broadly with the topic of anti-fascism. Some of them were super high-end. So, for example, like major exhibitions in the art museums, like major art institutions. Some of them were very low-key, right? And it was a kind of coalition of the willing. Of course, I would having this experience, I would definitely not overemphasize the role that art plays in society, right? Or basically art, culture, intellectual discourses, and so on and so forth. They are very important, but they have their limitations, right? I mean, if you think about statistically, still typically art punches much above its weight, right? So you have the budget of the largest institution in Poland is about like 12 million euros, largest, right? So this is basically possibly, I'm not sure, Kathrin, how much it would be. Possibly it's a kind of total annual revenue I'm talking, not an income. Possibly it is a kind of size, like the budget of like mid-sized, not even mid-sized, like kind of quite small to mid-sized company, right? It's not a lot of money, basically. It has maybe representative buildings. It has, it has kind of certain type of visibility, but visibility is also quite streamlined. Like in a streamlined, I'm saying if you do something in art, you just basically it's considered to be just art, right? But it doesn't have like a political valence, or people take it, bracket it out, unless you do such things like Kathrin. But these are still, we need to understand that they are on the one hand ubiquitous, but in this particular understanding of what art is and what is important in art, like this kind of like more of visibility, this is not necessarily forefronted. And what I wanted to, I wanted to add or finish. One thing that is, I think, like because Kathrin said about company drinks, but what I think is super interesting is also your rural practice, right? In a context, specifically in the political context of nowadays, right? In which you have, we on the one hand we see this cultural and economic dynamics in which most of resources, most of visibility, most of infrastructures are located in larger cities. It's not by chance that I live in Warsaw, in the capital of my country. You know, it's not by chance that you, Kathrin, also operate in London. And most of people who are moving, like who are moving from other places, and I was not born there, who are moving to these places are basically vacating their own local communities because they migrate to larger cities. There it's very easy to find like-minded individuals. This is where the infrastructure is located. This is what is visible, and so on and so forth, right? While as we are very well aware from like not only from the like most recent elections, basically like what happened yesterday, but generally speaking throughout Western states, you know, like most of the elections are being won by rural vote, like conservative, like authoritarian. This is a general dynamic, right? It's not about stereotyping. It's basically kind of the fact how you know, larger cities, larger towns are usually anti-Brexit, are you know, or like pro-liberal or pro-left in more or less kind of like, at least in majority of European countries. It was the case definitely in Poland. And rural in Poland, at least, is very dominated by a Catholic Church and by social media, you know. And this is and by kind of channels of communication that maybe that are often under kind of authoritarian control. So this kind of work with rural, this kind of work with villages, I think is super interesting, super important, and rare as well.
There's Kathrin.
Kathrin, please.
Yeah, I I thought I'd just say something before I need to go off to bed. But thank you so much. It was just a terrific presentation. And there was something you said right at the beginning, Kathrin, where you talked about the kind of privilege of the art space being a place where you don't have to think, well, you can try out things. You don't have to think efficiently. You don't have to do certain things that might happen in other spaces where you're actually trying to set up a business or something. There's a way in which that there's the freedom to experiment. And it just seems to me that what you're talking about is, in many ways, is almost like a laboratory for thinking about what it is to be a community economy. What are the logics of community economies that we could try and document and experiment with even more? So what's happened to company drinks, for instance? There's a sort of interesting trajectory there that is a different trajectory than the one that, you know, entrepreneurs might expect, or, you know, the growth trajectory or something. There's something interesting there that we could use to theorize what are the multiple kind of trajectories that associations might pursue in order to kind of continue people's connection and so on. But there's, you know, I've been trying to think about why is it that we don't have a sense in economics of other logics, like the logic of cooperation or the logic of flow, or, you know, all the different kinds of dynamics that we could be theorizing that are part of the economy that aren't the dynamics of accumulation and competition and all that kind of thing. But we don't really, you know, have space to kind of experiment with them. And so what it seems to me like Lumbung is really a space of experimentation, of distribution in a different mode, you know, and it's up to us in that connection between the community economy thinking and the practice of art to kind of start to identify those logics and theorize them even a little bit more, because it is the place where we can test them out, or we can start to flesh them out a bit more in order to speak back, Ligia, dear, to the economists who just, you know, they have their set of dynamics and that's it. It's like we don't, the innovation of them is pretty limited. You know, maybe financialization of everyday life is the new dynamic that's come up, or, you know, neoliberalization is one of the dynamics that's dominated. But what are the dynamics that we could start to explain or, you know, document? And it seems like perhaps one of where our laboratory is exactly in the kinds of things you're doing, or Aviv, you're doing in your community as kind of artists, but actually doing art, you know, economic practice. And it's almost like we need to spend a bit more time together trying to do that translation into something that would then, you know, be able to be seen by other people who need that economic logic language a bit more developed. Anyway, that was just the thoughts I had, but I found it a really wonderful presentation, very stimulating. And, you know, I've heard lots of it before, and I was there at the Whitworth. It was wonderful. I was there at the Plausible Economies wearing the same dress I've got on now at our workshop. But it's so lovely to hear you put it all together in the way that you've done that. And I hope, you know, it's the beginning of even more stimulating discussions about how we can work together. Thank you.
We're saying goodnight to you then, possibly. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye,
Thank you so much.
Catherine.
This is a
Thank
really
you.
nice way, if I can connect to what Ligia, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, earlier said, is a lot of this is a matter of translation. No? So me, I mean, I learned through working and making, but working in a business management school, the most overlaps, the most agreement I find with colleagues if we actually start using the word aesthetics rather than art. Because the whole idea of like aesthetic leadership, embodied management, blah, blah, you know, the artifact, the kind of like everyday gestalten of economic environments, that's where we find each other. That's where suddenly also the business students recognize that economics is not purely a cognitive skill. You know, it's not something you can think. It's also something you want to feel and you want to be happy with and you want to sense it. So that's a new trend, at least amongst our students, that they want to recognize this. And then, of course, you're very close to artistic practice, you know, which is like process driven, which is much more decisions are made based on senses, semiotics, bodily experience. And so even though that word aesthetics is almost worse than art, because it sounds even more complicated, but that's the term where I can meet with colleagues at the moment to say, okay, that's actually an area where art has a lot of competence, you know, to make decisions based on aesthetics, which you now recognize as important. So I just wanted to bring this in because for me, it's also a lot of the time it's about translating where are the terms where we actually come quite close. And they're normally not the terms I use within my art discourse. So it's a careful way of also listening and trying to sense a closeness that normally isn't seen.
Tuomo, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. Hi, y'all. Do we still have time? I guess we do. We're not all going to sleep yet. So thank you, Kuba and Kathrin, for a wonderful, inspiring presentation. It's wonderful to see all this proliferation of metaphors and visual signs and expressions, and just keeps, yeah, it's very, very inspiring. So as a practicing capitalocentric, your coin got me interested. You talked about how to flip it from the art as privatization part to art as commoning, but how do you struggle with or negotiate with efforts to flip it back? I'm thinking of whether you've encountered major art institutions trying to kind of co-opt some of the practices or networks or brands that you're creating. But I guess there's also a kind of bigger or more kind of theoretical abstract question or epistemological question behind concerning how we kind of recognize capitalist practices, even if we don't want to think in terms of capitalism. How do we recognize capitalist practices if we include things like collaboration and building CVs and kind of aesthetic production and production of desire, as many theorists have argued, in kind of in capitalist, in the category of capitalist practices or their tendencies. So how to kind of define and recognize kind of efforts or initiatives or power relations that try to co-opt some of what you're doing and proposing, and whether it's a kind of continuous negotiation and struggle or whether it's something rare and that you rarely encounter. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Such a good question and nice to see you here. It's of course continuous. of course, we are all complicit. I think that's why the term interdependence is quite useful. We are not, the iceberg is there. Like those systems that we hope to overturn will remain for a long time. So of course, in any situation, we are complicit, and I, for myself, company drinks, we flip the coin constantly. We sometimes, yeah, okay. But I think there's also, from my experience, because capitalism has naturalized itself so much, that the possibility of flipping the coin sometimes doesn't even occur anymore. Or maybe I'm just damaged by having lived in the UK for too long, where this idea of there's no alternative becomes truth. And then I think when we worked with the Whitworth and just then really work with groups quite in depth and in detail, like how does the collection work? Decisions are made because they've been made like this for the last 20 years. What do they affect? If we want a different effect, do we have to change our policies? And when we come to that detail, then for a lot of teams and groups, it becomes very obvious that they want to change their policies because they don't want to further a privatization of art. They want to support a commoning of art. But it sometimes just needs that space to also allow for attention to what we do with our economic mechanisms, which, as I said, they're so naturalized that they seem the only way to do it. Maybe that was a bit of a simple question, but yeah. And we remain complicit. There's no way we're going to have a purist system where the coin never has to be on the one side.
Yeah, but Kathrin, you finished on a note which is, I think, central, like in a sense that this is both sides of the same coin, right? So that's why we use this metaphor. It's not even that you flip it and it stays on one side; it's always there, kind of thing. It is, in fact, it's not a dialectic model. It is more a kind of, it highlights certain type of ambivalence. If it was a dialectic model, we would have some kind of resolution, a kind of like revolutionary moment in which, commons take over capitalism or whatever. Here, it's just like flipping, and very often it stays actually only on one side. This was like the aim of this on the one side, which is basically capitalocentric, which I think not capital, like this museum of 1%, however we called it, like this more, let's say, privatizing, exploitative, and so on and so forth. What I believe is happening, and here I follow more like a post-Marxist thinking, is that these commons are always there. This kind of like logic of like socially oriented logic of kind of gift, of enthusiasm, of working for free, and so on and so forth, is a huge underbelly of contemporary art, like this dark matter. It's always there, but it is rendered invisible. It's basically eradicated as a source of value, as a provider of labor, in order for these institutions to basically maintain their operations and for the market to function as if it was not necessary to even have this kind of like larger niveau in which it is situated. I base the market, and I mean like, more high-end kind of end market, but then this is also, of course, like a very schematic understanding of this. So this kind of coin is rather like the aim of this is to highlight, that there is this kind of commons related underpinning, that there is a choice, that there is an alternative, that you can orient yourself towards it, keep flipping it, like you're trying to support this more commons-based or commons-related logic, while acknowledging that usually the business as usual, it's basically more oriented or geared towards this kind of modes of privatization. It was also based in UK. Possibly, if we did, I used this scheme maybe just to give you, because you've also asked about like current situation, right? When I used this scheme in Poland, I typically joked that we would need a kind of three-sided coin, but like because we basically have like three operational models. Like one would be this kind of like more sort of like capitalist modernization. It's, Poland is a semi-peripheral country. Another one would be, let's say, the socially oriented, more commons-based kind of alternative. But in fact, the real alternative is more like state-run, very kind of like authoritarian type of museums that are geared towards or prop up nationalist discourses, right? which would be actually, which is one of the most viable alternative in a country in which most of the institutions are anyway public in a sense, and the art market is pretty weak. So then, you know, then it goes like, let's say let's say more economy oriented to more general, let's say sociological modeling of the different institutional models in which economy always plays a part, but it's only part of the larger assembly, let's say, or assemblage of the elements that are constitutive to these institutions.
So maybe this would be a good point to conclude if everyone is happy. Thank you, Kuba and Kathrin. That was really great. And thanks everyone for being here, participating, and hope to see you all in other Liviana sessions really soon.
Thanks, Aviv, and thanks for this amazing round. It was beautiful.
There are some questions. Are you, Aviv?
Are there questions? Am I missing
questions,
some questions?
like a kind of like, thank you. Could you also please share the Compass publication? How shall we share the Compass publication? Of course, we will be very happy to do it.
I
How do we
couldn't
do
find it
that?
on Google, so if you can please share it. It looked wonderful.
Can we share it in the
How shall we
chat?
do it?
Is it shareable in the chat?
I have a QR code. Kuba, do you have the link?
I mean, I don't have a link because it's not published online. I can.
It's online, but I only have a QR code.
Oh, okay.
Or if not, you can send it to the whole CERN list. I think it could be of interest. Yeah, I mean, I don't see any.
I think, like, give me 1 second and then I put it in the.
Yeah, let's not make it too public.
No, that's not the
We
problem.
don't want
It's
everyone
Why
to
not?
read it.
We just don't want
We don't want everyone
public
to read it.
You know, it's all out there anyway. You know, I'm one of the best messages I've ever got was like when somebody found my book in one of the you know, online repositories, bridging the copyright. You know.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, really, this is a bit silly. I just have a QR code, which I don't know how to put in the chat. So.
Yeah, but you can put it possibly. You can share the presentation, right? And then and then you will have a QR code.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the presentation is going to be shared, right?
No, I mean, you can share the screen now with a QR code.
Ah.
Yeah.
We have so fancy technology.
I send it to you now, and then the rest we organize. Oh.
I have another resource question. You shared, I mean, also just thank you. This was fantastic, so inspiring. And because I'm connected with an art school in Norway, Kuba, I was really curious about what you said, that when you teach in an art school, you talk about the multiple options for organizing. Do you have a resource on that as well?
Well, you know, I typically use, like, you know, it's a course. So it's, you know, it's basically I have a syllabi, but I'm afraid it's in Polish. But I give like the examples that Kathrin mentioned here, like, you know, I give like one of the funniest things is just to give databases to people and talk like, you know, it's quite often it's about art beyond art. So it's a bit about organizational logics. It's a bit about art as a field of possibilities, like what Kathrin said here.
Right.
And then all these different databases help quite a lot to substantiate this claim.
The Arte Util website is quite a useful website.
Yeah.
Sorry, which one?
Arte Util.
Arte Util.
Okay, cool.
Because I think it by now has like 300 examples of what can be read as art, but it has also other usership.
Fantastic.
Maybe I'll just, this is actually easy. Sorry. So this is Arte Util. Maybe this will be easier. This is another database that you may find interesting. If you're interested, like, just give me a moment making use. This is a kind of archive of an exhibition we did about this kind of usership-oriented stuff. This is if you are interested in a lot of people with banners and organizing like a lot of different stuff in Poland, this is a kind of Duck Rabbits archive. So this is a kind of like archive of this Office for Post-Artistic Services. I mean, just in case you may find it useful. Yeah, so like, I mean, like, and you also may be interested. It's quite an interesting resource. It's called Plausible Artworks. Sorry. So this is both kind of theoretically and as a kind of a resource. This is a very pretty interesting stuff. It's basically it's a quite old. It's, I mean, 10 years ago, so it's not too old. But this is a set of interviews made by a group called Basecamp and with Stephen Wright with the collectives worldwide. So it's actually, if you wanted to listen, possibly there are like, I mean, not even interviews, it's more like online gatherings, early days of Zoom, you know, before pandemic and so on. So when it has a kind of like, I think, flair of novelty, and they kind of made end of, you know, hype, you know, good old days of Skype. But then this is a kind of collection of these interviews made, or like with the gatherings made with like different collectives worldwide, in which they also talk about how they are organized and so on. So that may be, and maybe one more thing, like talking about current conjuncture, like just give me a second. I'll just find like there was an one issue of just trying to find it. Give me a moment. Are you looking for something, Kathrin, as well? Because I'm keeping people here. Just trying to find one last database, which may be.
Just
I think
love hanging out here, so no worries.
Yeah, especially since I see Jesse is circular knitting.
I need to go.
Me too.
And I need
Sorry, I was just trying to find one database. Yeah, that's it, I think. Well, whatever.
And Liga, I was just thinking
Cool.
maybe we should meet directly one day. I think this like this shared experience of.
Would love to meet you.
economist, but
Yeah, definitely. We'll send a message and
yeah, let's
we
have
can
a
speak.
coffee or something would be great.
Mhm.
So, friends,
Okay, so maybe one last thing. This is
Please.
from the field issue, but you may actually, it's an interesting thing. This is a field, it's a kind of like journal for socially engaged art. If you do not know it, like that's worthy to follow. And they organized in 2019 this kind of collective issue dedicated to art and anti-authoritarian activism. This was edited by Gregory Cholette. So if you want to,
Nice.
if you click on the link, you will see a lot of field reports from entire world. I think that's how it was organized. I'm not sure how it stayed online, but it's, yeah.
Beautiful. Cool.
Thanks, Aviv.
So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
And see
Thank
you
you.
all soon on a different screen, hopefully.
Have a
Thank you
good
so much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Kuba. Thank you, Kathrin.